Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining the first panel of Carl's Inclusion Perspectives webinar series, which has been organized by Carl's Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Working Group. I'm Julie Morin, one of the program officers at Carl, and I'd like to commence by acknowledging that I'm joining this webinar from the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation, here in Ottawa, where the Carl office is located. I would also like to acknowledge that the panelists in this series are joining us from the traditional territories of many Indigenous peoples who continue to live and work in this land today. I would also like to take this opportunity to run through a few housekeeping items. Participants have been muted upon entry. Our presenters will be taking questions at the end, so you're encouraged to type your questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Questions can be asked in French or English and can be translated by Carl staff if necessary. Links to the Carl Code of Conduct in both English and French have been included at the beginning of the chat thread. The organizers of this webinar are committed to providing a welcoming, professionally engaging, and safe experience. If you have any questions or concerns, please contact a member of the Code of Conduct Committee for this event, whose contact information has been listed in the chat. Finally, note that audio-generated captions have been enabled for this webinar, which is being recorded. Nos présentatrices répondront aux questions à la fin. Vous êtes donc encouragés à taper vos questions en utilisant la fonction questions et réponses au bas de votre écran. Les questions peuvent être posées en français ou en anglais et peuvent être traduites par le personnel de l'ABRC si nécessaire. Ce webinaire est en cours d'enregistrement. Des liens vers le code de conduite de l'ABRC ont été inclus au début du fil de discussion. Si vous avez des questions ou des préoccupations, veuillez contacter un membre du comité de code de conduite pour cet événement. Now I'd like to introduce our moderator for this session. So Dominic Silvio is a librarian at the Killa Memorial Library at Dalhousie University and a member of Carl's EDI working group. Without further ado, I'd like to invite Dominic to lead a discussion today.
Thank you, Julie. My name is Dominic Hakim Silvio, and I'm joining you today from Mi'kma'ki, the traditional and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq. And I would like to say welcome everybody and welcome from the bottom of my heart to see that a number of people have joined up to attend this inclusion perspective series. Before I introduce our panelists, I would like to also tell you the background to all this series. How did this all start about? Started in 2019 when Carl hired Maha Kumrane as the Carl Visiting Program Officer for EDI and established the EDI working group in July 2019. The group has been toiling for the first year, working on foundational documents on advancing EDI in Carl institutions. To date, the group, which is the EDI working group, has delivered Carl definitions of equity, diversity, and inclusion, created rules of engagement for the working group, conducted an environmental scan of Carl and non-Carl libraries' diversity plans, created and published the strategies and practices for hiring, retaining diverse talent, reviewed and advised on a number of Carl projects, including but not limited to creating a Carl Code of Conduct and the competencies for librarians in Canadian research libraries. Looking forward, the working group, which is the EDI working group, is now planning a series of webinars on inclusion perspectives. The next one will feature a panel of BIPOC librarians. The group is also advising Carl on a national diversity and inclusion study of its members, which is set to launch this September. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our panelists who have generously volunteered their time to come and talk to us about Black perspectives in librarianship. And the first person I'll call up is Mandisa Arlene. Mandisa Arlene has worked in libraries since 1996. I hope she's turned on the camera. Are you on? Oh yeah, all right, thank you. I'm not seeing you, I'm just reading from the script, so that's why. Anyways, Mandisa has been working in libraries since 1996. She started as a page and a library assistant at the Toronto Public Library and worked as a library technician at Seneca College, Centennial College, the Toronto District School Board, and as of 2003 at Ryerson University. While working as a library technician, she completed an undergraduate degree from Athabasca University in Professional Arts, majoring in Communication Studies, and a graduate degree from the University of Toronto in information science. During her time at Ryerson Library, she has also served in various technician, supervisory, and librarian roles, some of which included the AV, ILL, e-reserves and copyright, reference and web support technician roles, lead head and circulation supervisory roles, and interim systems, part-time staff coordinator, and communications and relation librarian roles. She currently serves as a library technician in the cataloging department at Ryerson Library. Mandisa is also involved in EDI-related activities. She served as a steward in her local union and as an active member of OPS EU's Workers of Color Caucus. She has also served on Ryerson's anti-racism task force, was an active member of Ryerson's Black Faculty and Staff Community Network, served as a member and chair of the Ontario Library Association's OLA EDI committee, and currently sits on both the OLA's and CAR's EDI committees. She was awarded Ryerson's Viola Desmond Stuff Award in 2016 and was also a Black Canadian role model inductee in 2016. She currently provides technical support for the annual 100 ABC, which is Accomplished Black Women, book and gala project, which features the accomplishments of notable Black Canadian women, and has also partnered with Dr. Anne-Marie Singh on the Criminal Justice First Project website, which documents Indigenous and racialized individuals who were among the first to enter policing, corrections, legal practice, and the judiciary in Canada. Welcome, Mandisa.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Thank you. The next person I'm going to welcome is Noda Bell. Turn on your camera, thanks. Noda is an associate librarian at York University Libraries. She has worked at York for over 16 years in a number of roles. She currently holds the position of teaching and learning librarian. But Noda has also held positions as scholarly publishing librarian, department chair, and research and instruction librarian. She is a founding member of the Visible Minority Librarians of Canada Network, VIMLOC, where she served as a co-moderator and developed the first mentorship program for visible minority librarians across Canada. She is also the founding book review editor for the International Journal of Information, Diversity and Inclusion. In this role, she aims to have a more diverse representation of book reviewers from various backgrounds and geographic locations. Her research interest centers around equity, diversity, and inclusion in various aspects of libraries and librarianship. Her latest publication was a chapter in the 2020 Humanizing LIS Education and Practice, edited by Karen and Nadia, about the different models of EDI professional development events for librarians. Her current research study explores the experiences of American and Canadian academic librarians at EDI professional development events and their effects on participants' attitudes, perceptions, and work-related practice. Noda is also a part-time professor in the Library and Information Technician program at Seneca College, where she has taught the Searching 1, Searching 2, and Searching 3 courses. Welcome, Noda. The last person I'm going, last but not least person I'm going to invite is Yamisi Dina. Yamisi, turn on your camera, please. Thank you. Yamisi is the Chief Law Librarian at Osgood Hall Law School Library, York University. Prior to this position, she joined Osgood in 2006 as Associate Librarian and Head of Public Services. She has worked in academic law libraries since 1995 in Nigeria, the Bahamas, and Canada. As a law librarian, Yamisi has participated in numerous professional development initiatives and programs. She is an active member of many professional associations, has recently been elected to the position of Vice President on the executive board of the Canadian Association of Law Libraries. She is the current chair of the African Interest Group of the Foreign, Comparative, and International Special Interest section of the American Association of law libraries. Yemisi is involved in many EDI initiatives serving on committees, boards, and working groups to reflect institutional guidelines and policies. Yemisi is widely published and is the author of the book, Law Librarianship in Academic Libraries. Welcome, Yemisi.
Thank you very much, Dominic, and it's a pleasure to be here today.
Thank you. So these are our panelists for today. And just to let you know that we have a set of questions that I'm going to ask the panelists. And well, the first question I'm going to throw out is, and I'm going to ask Mandy to please, Mandy, can you explain to us what does it mean to be a Black librarian in Canadian librarianship?
Okay. So being a Black librarian in Canadian librarianship, what works? Well, it's an honorable field that is premised on securing and curating information for easy access. It's a profession of service that allows us to help others. It's a profession that pays well, and for those with full-time career status, it's a profession with job security. Within the broader academic institution, it's also a profession that allows one to access many benefits and opportunities. Information is power, but it is also opportunity. And librarians, because of its legacy, and librarianship, because of its legacy and the protective structures built around it as a profession, is positioned to mitigate the tech giants such as Google, Microsoft, and Amazon, and allow for more equitable access to information. As a Black librarian, a lifelong library user, and someone who has worked in libraries for many years, I have been exposed to many different ideas and ways of looking at the world. And this exposure has saved and protected me in many ways. I have gained a lot from this profession. With each job application I submit, I include the sentiment that I love the work of libraries and what that work represents. And this remains true for me. However, what hasn't worked? For me, being a Black librarian in Canadian librarianship has included seeing examples of progress and inclusion around me, but not being able to access it for myself. And then having to align those professional realities, my own reality versus those of my colleagues, in a way that allows me to make sense of my lived experience, or this lived experience. W.E.B. Du Bois notes that as Black folks, we are required to employ a type of double consciousness to exist in this culture. That has certainly been true in terms of my personal experiences as a Black librarian. It means figuring out a way to successfully align the language used by the profession, that of inclusion and equity, and the pleasantries demonstrated by colleagues with the actual treatment received. And by that, I mean not so much the day-to-day, which in itself does produce its own indignities and microaggressions, but in terms of overall impact and outcomes. For example, when Black colleagues are denied the opportunity to progress professionally, it not only stagnates their professional growth, but also their economic mobility. That creates other systemic barriers for them as well. For me, those reconciliations have been difficult, particularly when coupled with complete silence in terms of a reason or rationale behind this treatment. Black librarians also find themselves having to deal with anti-Black racism without it being named or called out with specificity. Instead, terms such as diversity, equity, and inclusion are used as stand-ins. Now, without specifically naming an issue, how can the profession actually address it? Leadership that is willing to state and acknowledge and place resources behind addressing anti-Black racism will more likely see results. For example, in the Toronto Action Plan to confront anti-Black racism, Mayor John Tory states that anti-Black racism exists in Toronto. For Bazi Itar, in the article Vocational Awe and Librarianship, The Lies We Tell Ourselves, published in 2018, says about the power of naming, that it gives us a way to expose things that are so amorphous that they can be explained or guilted away, much like microaggressions. Black librarianship, again, for me and for the others I've spoken with, has meant constantly having to manage ourselves and our bodies, how we speak, how we dress, how we respond to aggression, both micro and macro, just so that we're not misrepresented. I am hyper careful about how I say what I say. As a result, the idea of transparency holds a measure of comfort and security for me. I appreciate the fact that interactions can be recorded, and so it's not just my perception or my word against my accuser's perception. For example, I have been called into HR for conduct, and the reason I can go in somewhat confidently is because I understand my place in this culture. I understand my precarious position, and as a result, I am extremely careful, like most other Black professionals, about how I engage. Hopefully, it never happens again. However, just in case the experience repeats itself, at least when actions and communications are transparent and recorded, there is proof, and there's comfort in that, at least for someone like me. The hope is that the judge, jury, and executioner will not be the accuser, but a third set of critical eyes and ears. HR itself has its own issues in terms of representation and who they seem to naturally side with, but that's for another talk at another time. Being a Black librarian, again, as I've experienced it and heard from other Black librarians, means coming to terms with the fact that those you see as colleagues and as equals perhaps do not see you in the same light. Of course, they're very polite, but the opportunities and dignities afforded through the institution and the profession somehow manage to escape your reach and are instead reserved for themselves and those that they favor. In the text, Presumed Incompetent, the intersections of race and class for women in academia, published in 2012 and edited by Gabriela Gutierrez Emo and others. The following is stated. Thus, Canadian universities remain key sites of enculturation for whites, since they are the places where the values and norms of the dominant culture are taught, affirmed, and taken for granted. The resultant privileges and confidence that whites take for granted are evidenced in the wages of the academic empire. Thus, it is not surprising that few whites have had the courage to speak out and challenge these structured exclusions. Furthermore, the absence of a critical mass of Aboriginal and racialized minority faculty also make it difficult for objects of repression to speak up for fear of reprisal. In this context, we must ask ourselves, at what point does the absence of racial diversity become what Baker describes as willful ignorance and aggression? For me, Black librarianship has been an experience, and more importantly, a reflective exercise of comparing myself with those that I work with and their various talents and qualifications, and wondering what is lacking on my end and what prevents me from inclusion into those opportunities. It means taking a similar approach to other white colleagues who seem to have figured out the secret path to opportunity and upward mobility, but having missed this mark myself. It means experiencing colleagues who came into both the institution and the profession after me, or who shadowed me in different areas of library work, who was somehow able to achieve the goal of permanent career status where I was not. It's having well-meaning colleagues ask me what I had done wrong or who I had managed to offend, because of course, the blame must lay somewhere. It's me asking myself the same questions. I recall one incident of a colleague comparing my situation to another white colleague who had left to work elsewhere, implying that the white colleague who left, unlike me, would not stand for what was happening in the library at the time. In any case, this did not take into account that white librarians have so much more flexibility and ease of movement within the profession than BIPOC librarians do. I will stop here for now and allow Norda and Yemisi to respond as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Mandy. Norda, Yemisi, I know this is a difficult conversation, and I will just ask our audience and the members of the audience to please, take it with a grain of salt, right? Because we are speaking from diversity perspectives and we're being honest with ourselves. So Yemisi or Norda, please, do you have anything to add? What should be changed? What has happened? What has worked? What needs to be changed? All right, welcome, any one of you. Yemisi, you want to go ahead or Norda? Any one of you should go ahead. No problem.
I think I'll just add to that. So I agree with a lot of what Mandy said. We are being vulnerable by speaking about our experiences. I think I have the privilege in that I'm in a certain position right now where I've been a librarian for how many years, and I have so-called academic freedom. So I do recognize that that speaking out, and I think I want us to recognize that being vulnerable, we're being vulnerable by talking about these things. So I agree. I feel I've been very critical about, let me go back. So what's been happening lately, we had the verdict last week on the George Floyd trial. And what I feel that happens in library, being a Black librarian, is that that when I enter the library, all those things, my Blackness and my Black experience, being racially profiled, having experienced racial discrimination, the assumption it disappears when you enter the library. And that's not true. As Mandy said, we have these Black bodies and we experience these things outside of the library, and when we, it's part of our identity as Black librarians. I think what needs to be changed, I think fundamentally, is acknowledging the Black perspective and that this does happen and we take these things. It's been very emotional the last few weeks, a whole year. What's been going on currently with Black Lives Matter. Suddenly this awareness around, police brutality and racial discrimination, anti-Black racism, that has been, so to Black people, most Black folks, I know it's nothing new, it's not new, but suddenly there's this sudden consciousness and it's great that we're working on these things and we're using this opportunity to bring awareness about what's going on. But for people, as a Black librarian, this is not something that's new. As a Black person, it's not new. So I think Black perspectives must be heard. There needs to be a respect for BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color librarians. It's great that we're doing this, that you're hearing voices, you're hearing perspectives, and we're having these conversations, because I don't think that we've had these conversations, at least not here in Canada, in librarianship. And I think it's important to understand that, as I said, I have the privilege, I'm speaking out, and there will be consequences, obviously, sometimes when you do speak out about anti-Black racism or calling out whiteness in libraries, calling out that the library is not neutral, the institutions we work in are not neutral, that is a problem. So I think what needs to be changed is when we're looking at diversity, when we're looking at all the, as a Black librarian, when we're looking at all the systems in place in our institutions, in our libraries, that we need to look at it from a critical lens. And I don't think that we've done that so far. So that for me is the most important thing that needs to be changed.
Thank you, Noda.
So I agree with Noda and Mandy, and I think we're going to be here for the entire time if I have to start telling stories. But I've experienced, repercussions of speaking out and, but now I would say I'm in a position of authority, but, my role is just to say that, many of these things didn't work. And it's just not right for the awareness to start coming out because of the George Floyd issue or incident. But, those in authority and then maybe associations, should continue to do critical reflections of how, Black librarianship will foster in Canada. Because for me, I have been able to flourish a lot, to progress in, across the border. I've been given opportunities. I'm just starting to experience that opportunity in Canada. But going forward, I think, all those associations should take critical reflections of, and the institutions as well, how opportunities will be given to BIPOC librarians, not just Black librarians, but Indigenous librarians. I don't really know any Indigenous librarian, close to me in my setting. I know Indigenous faculty members, but I don't know any Indigenous librarian close to me that I can say, I can relate to. So, organizations like CAL, Canadian Association of Law Libraries, we should all sit down and start having those conversations. So I'm so glad that this is happening. And I think I'll stop.
Thank you all. I am also glad that this is happening. Like I mentioned earlier, these are difficult conversations that we need to talk about. These are, like you mentioned that in Canada, this is not being talked about, and it's true, and I have this weird idea that Canadian librarianship is not open to the other, which means the BIPOC group, but having these conversations will really, start kick off what what should be part of the Canadian librarianship. Now, you folks have alluded to the next thing that I want you to talk about, and I'm just going to go back to Mandy again. Mandy, within the last couple of years, there have been so many research published by white Canadian librarians on the idea of racism in librarianship in Canada. And this idea of white supremacy is still also very prevalent in the Canadian librarianship. So what systems and structures and policies need to change in order to dismantle this idea of racism within librarianship in Canada? What systems, structures, and policies need to change? So, Mandy, I'm just going to give you the chance to have a take at it. And I just want to remind the folks that these are personal opinions, all right? So it's not the opinion of all Black folks. It's just Mandy's, Noda's, and Yamis's. Mandy, welcome, please. You're muted, Mandy. Unmute yourself. Thank you.
Sorry, my cat was being noisy. Okay. Okay, so here we go. Census data does not tell us how many Black librarians are in the field. And it also doesn't tell us how many Black librarians are in academia in Canada. It does tell us, however, how many visible minority librarians there are. And according to the 2016 census, where visible minorities made up 22% of the Canadian population, visible minority librarians accounted for only 11% of librarians in Canada. This compared to 40% of incoming students self-identifying as visible minorities during that same time period. Now, if only 11% of the librarian pool are visible minorities, that means the remaining 89% are white. The 11% of visible minority or BIPOC librarians also account for both public and academic libraries. If we were to divide that number in half, giving 5.5 to public and the rest to academic libraries, which is a very generous extrapolation, as I'm sure academic libraries have a lot fewer BIPOC librarians, that 5.5% would still need to be significantly reduced to represent Black Canadian academic librarians. Another KPAL study found slightly lower percentages, where 19.1% of the Canadian population identified as visible minorities. That compared to 9.1% of Canadian librarians identifying as visible minorities. So whiteness and the notion that white perspectives and white or Anglo-European ways of seeing and behaving in the world hold more value and are superior to BIPOC perspectives, and employing hiring practices that support this notion needs to change. In April Hatchcock's article, White Librarianship in Blackface, published in 2015, Hatchcock notes that the normativity of whiteness works insidiously, invisibly, to create binary categorizations of people as either acceptable to whiteness and therefore normal, or different and therefore other. The invisible nature of whiteness is key to its power. When it is not named or interrogated, it can persist in creating a culture of exclusion behind the scenes. The privilege of silence and the hope that this will all pass with time. The option of silence is a privilege of the privileged. However, those in leadership positions should not have or even really want access to that privilege. Organizational culture is created and maintained from the top down. And so having leadership who remain silent or tokenistic on these issues translates and trickles down through the organization. It also provides license for those looking on to do and feel the same. Audre Lorde warns the BIPOC community on the receiving end of this silence. Those of us living with the impact and effects of this racism and discrimination. Lorde warns that our silence will not protect us. That's what I have, Dominique. Thanks, I'll stop here.
Thank you. Give a chance to Noda or Yemisi, please. Can you add in what systems, structures need to be changed to, get rid of this racism that many researchers have talked about in librarianship?
I'll talk.
Go ahead, Noda.
Dominique, this is a very loaded question. It's huge. It's a huge question. It's like, oh my gosh, like what needs to be changed to dismantle racism is not going to happen in a year. It's not going to happen in 5 years. It's not going to happen in 10 years. So I say first understanding that it's going to take a lot of time to undo 500 years of oppression. So, but I think it's very important to, instead of identifying specific systems, it's very important to first acknowledge, as Mandy said, our policies are not race neutral, okay? They do privilege some while excluding others. And we see this in so many aspects of librarianship. So we need to counter whiteness or white domination by first naming it and unpacking all the areas of librarianship in our institution. So I could speak to like some of the parts of librarianship. But I think for me, lately I've been thinking about the DI, diversity, equity, inclusion work, and those committees and task force, and sort of being more critical of them when Black or BIPOC librarians are required or pressured into working on DEI related task force and committees, and that's when their voices need to be heard, or they're being representative of other DEI projects, initiatives, because of their racialized identities, without that power. This work involves a lot of emotional labor, a lot of time. Often this time is not considered in, so policies or tenure and promotion policies for academic libraries where librarians have faculty status. If you are devoted, and especially for those who are sole BIPOC librarians, and you're expected, and we see this with the Indigenous faculty and librarians, they're being called to represent and work on these initiatives where at the detriment of doing research and doing everything else that's required for their position, that to advance to more, to be promoted, or just to go through the tenure and promotion process. So, so I think, for example, that's one example that we could look at, the TNP, but like going back to like the pipeline to academic librarianship, some of the systems, now they're not all related to libraries, because as I said, my Blackness doesn't disappear, my Black experience doesn't disappear when I enter the library, but all of these policies and systems, systemic racism that's happening in the greater society, they're influenced and they're replicated in the library. So it's interesting that Mandy talked about the percentage of visible minorities. We have affirmative action plans. We have employment equity in libraries and in universities. And the equity seeking group is visible minority, right? And so that's one group for all visible minority, whether you're Black, Asian, whether you're any person who's not Aboriginal and who is non-white. That's their definition of visible minority. When we look at that, we don't actually look at the different categories. So Black versus, all the different groups. So that's a disadvantage, because we know there are model minorities, and we know that the experience of a Black librarian, a Black person, is not the same as someone that's Asian or South Asian, et cetera, and Aboriginal. So looking at employment, looking at the precarious employment of racialized librarians, when they're hired, who gets the part-time positions, who gets these they're hired as special projects, not necessarily the full-time permanent positions. So looking at your employment policies, and if you find that most racialized library staff members, librarians, are in these precarious situations, then there's a problem there. So you need to articulate that. As I said, the pipeline to academic librarianship, we need to navigate that educational system. And of course, we all know about, going to elementary school, but we're not going to deal with elementary school, secondary school, but the pipeline, even if we start from the undergraduate degree to getting our MLS, along the way, there are lower expectations for Black students. Streaming in high school may not make you qualified for university. What happens if your MLS is not from an ALA accredited university? What if you have your librarian, but you're educated outside of North America, outside of a white Western sort of society? In academic libraries, the second master's degree or a PhD makes you more competitive, but if BIPOCs are socioeconomically disadvantaged because of racism, anti-Black racism, they're less likely to pursue a second master's degree for financial barriers and being less competitive. When we look at promotion and leadership opportunities for BIPOC library workers, and I say library workers and librarians, but library workers, when you look at the data for the representation of racialized library staff, a lot of the library staff racialized employees in libraries, library workers are in staff positions and not in those positions of power. And for obvious reasons, financial barriers is another. So looking at that pipeline, looking at the leadership opportunities that are available in your library is important. I think we also have to remember that academic and research libraries are part of a larger university institution. And so we obviously are, the universities were not designed for a BIPOC. They were not designed for Black, Indigenous, people of color, nor were they designed for women. So there is a legacy that sort of needs to be dismantled. And so there's a lot there. And I do recognize that. But I think the first step is acknowledging that there is racist policies and systems. We don't see them. So we need to actually take the time to look at them and pull them apart in order to dismantle racism. And it's not going to happen in 1 year.
Excellent. Yeah, Missy, anything else you want to add to it?
I don't think I have much to add because Nada and I are coming from the same institution. And so we're using the same lens. So maybe for other institutions, maybe a check, an environmental scan or check of all those policies. Why have people been facing so much barriers? Why aren't we hiring people from this group? And if it happens that they've left, why did they leave? Why are people leaving? Things like that.
Thank you, Missy. I think you guys have allowed me into my third question, which is looking into why, talk about Black librarians here, maybe in June we'll talk about BIPOC, but why, Black folks are not coming into library school. And I think Node talked about it, Missy just added something to it. So I'm just gonna ask you this question. From library schools to candidate presentations and permanent status, promotions, what meaningful changes can our community introduce in 2021? So we're talking, this is forward looking, to see the results of a practical strategy to help Canadian academic librarianship attract and retain more Black librarians. So what can we do, beginning from the library school and throughout the whole, and I'm going to go to Norda because Norda, you are one of the folks who started this mentorship program for BIPOC librarians. Please, can you, address this question for us?
Yeah, Dominic, this is another question that it's hard to answer. It's so hard to answer because, okay, so the key to this, I think, question for me is meaningful change. So what can we do to attract and retain more Black librarians? So we could recruit more Black librarians, from my experience, by actively seeing, and I've talked about how being a Black librarian is both being invisible and being hyper visible in different situations. But I benefited from working in a library where a manager and other librarians recognized and talked to me and suggested that I explore librarianship as an option. So, actively seeking, seeing and encouraging the students. Look at your students that are working in your libraries to help them sort of, nudge them and encourage them. Students also need to see others that look like them in this role. And so sometimes they don't even think about it until they actually see someone that look like them in this role. So I like to say, make visible the invisible. So looking at your students that are working in the library, looking at your library staff members for potential as well and encourage them. And as I said before, there is a barrier. The financial barrier is there. So even though, you pique an interest, there's an interest from library staff members who want to pursue the MLS or library students, student workers, establish, the financial barriers there. So I would love to see that establishing a scholarship for Black, Indigenous, people of color, library students and programs for students to be mentored allowing them to network and having experiences working in libraries. And I feel we have those programs in the States. Yes, we're looking at the States. The States have the numbers and they have more, but I think it would be great if we could do that. So, but I'm conflicted about the mentoring because, you know, I've been reading Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist, and I've been ruminating and I've been thinking about his work. He talks about assimilation as a form of racist idea. And so the idea that we need to change BIPOC's librarians' behavior, library students, their behavior, their appearance to conform to the dominant whiteness of librarianship is, you know, problematic. So I'm kind of torn. Mentoring programs where just because of the numbers, a predominantly white librarian mentors a BIPOC student or librarian can be seen as replicating whiteness, or could be seen as focusing on the BIPOC librarian as the problem, when it's really, it's institutional racism. So they're the problem, so they need to learn to assimilate. So I struggle with that because I do believe in mentoring and I think it's helpful. I also, like, for those who, the librarians, as I mentioned, with foreign credentials, I think, you know, can we commit to establishing a program to assess their foreign training and address these gaps? I feel like they're so invisible, like we don't really talk about that. So I don't know much about the ALA accreditation process, but we need to, I feel that we need to look into that system with an anti-racist, critical race theory sort of lens to understand how this system might exclude others. So when you have foreign credentials, you're a librarian in another country and you come here, are there programs that could help you instead of, you know, instead of doing it all over again and entering a program, if you can financially? So programs to assess, but maybe programs, scholarships, money, resources to help those who want to remain as librarians in this country. I think that's great. So these are some things, but so if you recruit, and we tend to focus on representation to solve the diversity problem, and then we kind of forget about retention. So if we build it and they come, what will they face? So I feel like these are like feel good solutions, what I call sort of like performance. On one, they could be performative, that we can check mark and feel good about, like, we've done this and it'll make a difference for sure. But I would like us to think carefully about the environment once BIPOC, whether it's Black, Indigenous, people of color, what they face once they're in these situations, they're hired into it. And Mandy talked about some of the challenges already. So if we agree that libraries are not neutral, they're not race neutral, that there are policies, there are systems, there are processes, there are practices that exclude some and privilege others, what is the institutional climate like for BIPOCs once they're in librarianship? What is so the institutional at the university level, what is the library climate like? We can't explore looking at retention of Black librarians without exploring the white spaces that they're in and their experiences. So I think instead of, and like, okay, I don't want to discount the other things that I mentioned, but instead of focusing too much on hiring more Black or diverse librarian representation, maybe we need to look at who has the real power in the library to make changes. So who makes the policies? Like, who really, there are committees, but who's the real person, the real people who make the policies? How many BIPOC racialized librarians are in senior management positions? Are these leaders then challenging these systemic policies that exclude? Are they calling out whiteness or even acknowledging that our libraries are not neutral? So I think what we could do is, you know, library leaders, senior administrators, library directors. So this is a Carl webinar. So we could start with Carl. We can start with a commitment and action plan for Carl directors who really hold the power in their libraries to make changes, to acknowledge white domination, whiteness, and systemic racism, and to audit their diversity efforts at their respective institutions. So audit policies and systems. So I've been following Amanda Fernandez from Inclusify. She is a person of color. She is a librarian. She does diversity audits and anti-racism workshops. And so I've been following her for a while, and I admire her work. And so I think she gets it. And I think if we move away from DI, like the diversity, equity, inclusion committees that don't have any power, because we have it every, like there's, this is something we have across libraries where there is a DEI committee, but I think we need to ask questions about whether they have the power to actually make change, and instead devote resources for leaders who have the power to make changes, to get them to actually understand the problems, using critical race theory, anti-racist approach, and not feel good performative diversity work. So that's vital. And I think that's the most meaningful change that we could do for 2020 for me. But I want to be clear that I'm not saying that these recruitment strategies are not important, but my concern is around the library workforce once someone is hired. And my experience has been, as a Black librarian, has been that everything is fine when you stick to the status quo in terms of thinking and behaving and acting like the majority of other librarians. But once you bring your lived experience, once you become authentic and you bring your perspective as a Black person, a Black woman, and you call out these things, exclusion, race, or whiteness, any truth that make those, any truth that I say that make those in power uncomfortable, that you're seen as a problem. It's not conducive to retention, and library leaders have to, like, they have a role to play. So I say, go to the top, go to the leaders. And I think that's what we could do that will impact both hiring, recruiting, and retention and promotion of Black leaders. I also think there's a book, I don't know if you guys have seen it, Knowledge Justice, Disrupting Library and Information Studies Through Critical Race Theory. It's edited by Sophia Leong and Jorge Lopez McKnight. It's coming from the United States, but it's the first book in our field in LIS that actually examines our field, library information science, using a critical race theory lens. So, you know, if we could all commit to reading that as well, I think that's a step. So there you go.
All right, Nora, thank you. I don't think I'm going to give any chance to Mandy or Yemisi because we are almost reaching 5 p.m. for me, Nova Scotia time, which is 4 p.m. Ontario time and Eastern time. But I have a question that I would like Yemisi to answer, and I think talks about from the general public about cluster hiring of Black librarians. What are your thoughts on that? You know, cluster hiring of Black librarians, because I think that it's from Reese Steinberg, and she said, "What are I don't know Reese," and said, "What are your thoughts on cluster hiring of Black librarians as part of a solution to help hire and retain more Black librarians and provide support for those hired?" So, what are your thoughts about cluster hire? This is now something that is happening now these days. What are your thoughts about that?
Yes, so I think this, this is something that organizations can do, as things are evolving and shifting over time. So they should accommodate all this interest and then do cluster hiring of, BIPOC, Black librarians, to ensure that, their presence is there in the profession as well.
All right. Thank you. I'm going to throw the ball back to Katia and Christine. Katia, for the question and answer time, we have only 4 minutes left, and probably get 1 or 2 questions. Yeah, so Katia, please, or Christine, you have the questions there. If you can bring them up and ask our panelists. Where's Katia? Where's Christine? I don't see them here. Christine, are you there? Katia? Okay, yeah, okay. So there's Yeah, and I see there's a question that they posted here. There is something that says, what are your thoughts on achievement culture in academic librarianship, where librarians compete with each other for merit increases and other advancement opportunities? So what are your thoughts on achievement culture in librarianship? And I'm guessing this is, you know, you from a Black person's perspective. Anybody can, what are your thoughts on achievement culture that you have to achieve? You don't care about the other folk, you just care about yourself. Do whatever it takes, you know. It's like having those, you know, when you put ants together in a bottle, each one will come out, right? So the crumple on each other. So this is the achievement culture, the friendship. So what are your thoughts about this? Anybody wants to jump in? Yamisi?
Well, I think it's just, I don't think it's, you know, just among Black people alone. I think it's among everybody. Like the competition is just a natural thing for people, but we just have to keep striving and keep doing our best. But the institutions should create opportunities, you know, more opportunities. And also we shouldn't wait for them to give us those opportunities. We should strive by ourselves. So maybe that's what that person is saying about, you know, competition, culture competition. So you don't wait for the institution to throw the opportunity at you, but you continue to pursue it and look for those opportunities.
Okay.
I like
to
pipe up a little for that. From a Black perspective, I think, you know, I feel that Blacks have to work harder to accomplish things. So you always feel you have to do just to be recognized or to be seen competent. You have to work so much harder. So I think there's a natural, and I'm speaking for myself, from my experience, that achievement, that high bar for achievement, because you learn earlier on that you are not at the same level as others. You will not be, the assumptions about your intelligence, about your competence will not be at the same level as your non-BIPOC counterparts. So I think I think you naturally have that you need to achieve, and you need to set the bar high for yourself as a Black librarian. I feel like there's things that you could do so I'm coming from an institution where we have you know, tenure and promotion. So you have faculty status. So my answer would look different before. When you're trying to achieve tenure and promotion, obviously you will have to buy into this achievement culture. But I feel that after that, that there's more freedom, or I hope that, you know, I feel like there's more freedom after tenure and promotion to not buy into that, and to do work that I feel is fulfilling and that's authentic to myself. So that's my answer to that question.
Yeah, and I think there's a comment here that somebody said agreed with your idea of the ALA accreditation of MLI's degrees. But the question is, how can, I think this is a question from Johanna Whitson, said, how can we normalize spending the time to look up the school a job applicant attended before, they said something's coming up, I'm missing them here in the text, sorry. Yeah, so before a job applicant attended, before excluding them or asking them to redo years of education in order to advance in their career. So the whole point is, yes, she agreed with the ALM, you know, that's for me, it's a system that I don't agree with, but how can we also as well, you know, and then when you apply for a job, you look at the school that you went to exclude somebody or to, you know, force them to go back to school. How can we do that? I think this is the question. I hope I got it right from Johanna.
Yeah, so I can speak to that because I have a foreign degree. And I think when I was hired, there is a body in Canada that looks at those degrees and accredits them. just like, maybe similar to the to what the legal practitioners do. There is a body that does that, but I don't think librarians, institutions do that. So, but I went out of my way to accredit my degrees so that it is not excluded. And, so, but I don't think it's many institutions that do that. So I think maybe Carl as a body can start that more like what the legal practitioners and maybe many of the professions, like the engineers, they also have a body that accredits those foreign degrees. So that's how we can, look at that barrier for colleagues who have international degrees. It's a problem. And I think it should start, an organization like Carl can focus on that and build up something that can, help to address that barrier.
Excellent. I don't think I'm going to be, Manny, you want to say something?
No, yeah.
Okay. All right, so I think we've gone past our time, but there's so many comments here for thanking the panelists for their honesty in sharing their experiences and giving their opinion on what we need to see in Black librarianship. And I also like to echo that thank you to our smart and beautiful panelists, and also want to encourage folks to let folks know that this is not the end, but this is maybe the beginning of the conversation, and we need to encourage this kind of conversation so that we know that librarianship is not only meant for a specific group, but it's meant for all. So I'm just going to let Julie back in, and Julie, please take over. Thank you.
Just a few closing remarks from me. So on behalf of Carl, I'd like to thank Dominic, Mandy, Norda, and Yemisi for their invaluable contributions to this discussion. I'd also like to thank members of Carl's EDI working group for planning these sessions and all of our participants for attending. We hope to continue to provide a platform for these conversations going forward, and we ask that you keep an eye out for upcoming webinars in this series, including a June panel featuring BOP members of the library workforce, where some of the remaining questions from this session may be addressed. So Thanks again all, and have a great week. Pasen bonne semaine.